They Were Expendable, 1945. At number 10 I've picked a bit of an oldie, and it's even a John Wayne movie to boot. They Were Expendable is one of those movies that entertained me in differing ways in different stages of my life. When younger, it was simply an exciting war adventure with lots of action. Later in life, however, I began to appreciate it for its underlying historical meaning. This movie has so much to commend it by way of authenticity. It was directed by none other than John Ford and starred Robert Montgomery and John Wayne. Both Ford and Montgomery had first-hand experience of naval action during the Pacific Theatre. In fact, some of the incidental footage featured in the movie was taken by Ford himself during what we now call his embedding with the US Navy during the war. The story follows the introduction of these newfangled patrol torpedo boats during America's early introduction to World War II. Like anything new in the armed forces, having formed the unit, the top brass was a little hard-pressed to know what to do with them. So, the crux of the movie is that Lieutenant Brick Brickley, played by Montgomery, and Lieutenant Rusty Ryan, played by Wayne, are trying to prove the usefulness of their boats, which, of course, they eventually do, with some very successful attacks on the Japanese Navy. That in itself is enough to keep a young war movie fan gripped throughout the whole 135 minutes of the film. However, as I got older, I began to recognise the rather more thought-provoking subplots in the story which were less gung-ho than the usual 1940s Hollywood war movie. Unusually, this movie highlights the US's early war years when they were suffering some initial setbacks and defeats at the hands of the Japanese. Because of this, we see a rather more muted and self-deprecating performance by the cast as they reflect a more gritty and downbeat feeling about those early years of the war. In fact, in my opinion, They Were Expendable is perhaps the closest Hollywood comes to making a British-style war movie in its stoic atmosphere and choice of subject. This reflects the stark reality faced by the US in late 1941, early 1942. The threat the Japanese posed and the unpreparedness of the US military came as a bit of a shock to the usually bullish Americans. In particular, the scenes of the chaotic evacuation and retreat by US forces in the Philippines came close to making this America's Dunkirk moment. The subsequent fall of the island and the infamous Bataan Death March of American and Filipino prisoners highlighted just how close Japan had come to achieving its goals of knocking America out of the war early on. This movie was made in 1945, and it would have been hard to imagine such a, at times, sombre and thoughtful movie being made any earlier in the war. To have floated the idea of such a production just a couple of years earlier would have been inconceivable, as it might have been viewed as somewhat unpatriotic or defeatist by the US government. Sadly, this was one of the reasons that the film fared so badly in the box office. Released in December 1945, just a couple of months after the close of World War II, the US public had little appetite for war movies. In fact, They Were Expendable was nowhere to be seen in the top-grossing Hollywood productions of that year. The idea that things were on a knife edge during those early years of the war was perhaps an unpalatable and unwelcome memory for America. They Were Expendable is in fact one of my two favourite World War II era American war movies. The other is 12 O'Clock High, starring Gregory Peck, which again was an uncharacteristically frank portrayal of some of the realities of war. The two movies are almost interchangeable for my number 10 spot, though They Were Expendable made the cut in the end because of its exciting PT boat action sequences which appealed to both the younger and older me.